Hello, and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we will discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine. I'm Dr. Jack West, Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. I'm very happy to be joined today by my co-host, Dr. Charu Aggarwal, who is the Leslie M. Heisler Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hey, Charu.
Hi, Jack. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Love and Dr. Stephanie Graff. Dr. Susan Love is the Chief Visionary Officer for the Dr. Susan Love Foundation, and Dr. Stephanie Graff is the Director of the Breast Cancer Program at the Sarah Cannon Cancer Institute, HCA Midwest Health, and Associate Director of the Breast Cancer Research Program at Sarah Cannon Research Institute. And she's also the Medical Advisor to the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation, and also a good friend. Welcome, Susan and Stephanie.
Thank you
for having us.
Would like to get started with a question that both Jack and I have been sort of toying with over the past couple of days as we've been doing a little bit more research into the foundation. And Jack, would you like to get started with this question about Susan and how she's such a trailblazer?
Well, sure. I think in a lot of ways, but one of the leading ones is that we are obviously still talking and thinking about gender equity and challenges that women in particular are facing in moving forward in their career paths and opportunities. But I strongly suspect that it is nothing like the challenges, the headwinds that you faced. And I know that you were the first woman, leading a surgery program at Beth Israel in Boston. And all along the way, you've, I imagine, been the first doing a lot, but I also imagine it hasn't always fallen into your lap. And can you talk about some of the challenges that you faced and really whether you feel gratified that it's gotten better or frustrated that we are still facing these issues years, decades down the line?
Well, basically, when I'm old. So when I went to college, the Vietnam War was still going on. And I wanted to be a doctor, but they said, if you go to medical school, you'll take some guy's place and he'll die. And it'll be all your fault. So I ended up going to medical school anyway, and I'm sorry to whoever it was that had to go to die in the war. But and there were quotas in medical schools at that time. I went to downstate, which had 10% women. Every place else was 5%. And when I finished, I trained in surgery, and I was lucky enough to get a position at Beth Israel in Boston. And Bill Silen, who was the chief there, who was quite a curmudgeon, but he was very strongly in favor of having women surgeons. And so I trained there. And then when I finished, I was chief resident, but nobody offered me a job. So I hung up a shingle. And the only patients that were sent to me were women with breast problems. So the way I became a breast surgeon was sort of default because that's what fell in my lap. But the good thing was it was just at the time when we had data that was actually, we had randomized controlled data telling us what was the best treatment. Veronese in Italy did a study looking at extended radical mastectomy versus lumpectomy and radiation to see if there was a difference. And there was no difference. And the NSABP was just starting, Bernie Fisher was just starting a trial here of lumpectomy and radiation versus mastectomy, which also ultimately showed no difference. So it was an exciting time, and things were changing, and we were starting to use systemic treatments, chemotherapy, which we hadn't used before. Before it was just basically hormonal manipulation, quote unquote. And then you could explain it to people. You could tell them what was going on. So that really was what got me into breast surgery. It was basically sexism.
Great. But going into surgery also, I think, shows some particular courage, because I imagine that was one of the fields where there would be the greatest resistance, Dr. Seilen notwithstanding, perhaps.
Yeah.
But did you ever have second thoughts, regrets about doing it, or was it something that you just loved surgery enough to put up with all of that challenge
that's what I like to do. I enjoy operating, and I enjoyed figuring it out and explaining to people, and I still enjoy that. I mean, I still want to get my hands in even in the research. We're doing sort of surgical kinds of research. So that's what I like. And I'm still working on it.
Excellent.
You left surgical practice at a time when it was really unheard of. What are you going to do? What do you mean you're leaving surgical practice?
Yeah.
So what were the forces behind that decision? And what were some of the challenges you faced? Were there some sort of internal discussions in your head? The voices in your head, and do you miss it?
I miss it a little bit. I miss the people more than the actual doing it. But the thing was, I was a breast surgeon in Boston. I was a breast surgeon. Then I was recruited out here to LA and set up the breast program at UCLA. And at the end of the guaranteed salary, then they said, okay, now you have to earn your living cutting. And really, breast surgery doesn't pay that well. I mean, it may be better now, but then it certainly didn't pay very well. And so I said, I don't think so. And I had just gotten an advance on a book about hormones for menopause, and how maybe it wasn't such a great idea to put all women on postmenopausal hormones. And so I had some money. So I went to business school and wrote the book. And while in business school, I sort of caught the startup vibe. And I had always had this idea that breast cancer starts in the lining of the milk ducts. And so if you could actually get into the milk duct and sample some of that fluid, you might be able to diagnose it earlier and maybe even treat it. And so I started a company doing, quote, ductal lavage, we called it. And it was quite successful because it was acquired by another company and everybody made money. The problem was it was acquired by a mammography company that was trying to kill it rather than, and I wanted to change the world. So that didn't work very well. I did a couple of other startups, and then I decided to focus really on trying to figure things out with the research through the foundation. And I inherited the foundation from a guy named Otto Sartorius in Santa Barbara, who had been doing similar kinds of work. And we ultimately moved it down to LA, and it is the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation for Breast Cancer Research. We just changed the words around.
I'm interested to know, obviously, medicine has a history over a long time of paternalism, but breast cancer in particular, and a disease of women, in the last several years to decades, are we still facing that kind of mindset of decisions made on behalf of women, or have we gotten over some of it by this point? Much more data driven.
I think we're much more data driven, don't you, Stephanie? I think there's a lot of data, as opposed to many places in surgery where there is none.
Yeah, I think like most of healthcare, there's always good eggs and bad eggs, but I think that breast cancer has really benefited from robust research, and there's data that drives most decisions that we make. And I think that it has also attracted a lot of people really committed to communication around these decisions. I mean, it's a very breast cancer patients require a lot of time commitment and discussion. It's a very emotionally heavy field where we spend a lot of times talking about how to make these decisions with our patients. And you guys know that. I'm talking to 2 lung cancer researchers.
But it's a different population. That is absolutely true. And in some ways, I mean, there's no patients, I think, who are more engaged than the breast cancer population. And frankly, as lung cancer docs, we're somewhat envious of that vibrant advocacy community, the fundraising, and because lung cancer, maybe in part because there's more men than women, or at least historically that's been the case, and not as many survivors, all sorts of reasons. But I would say that online and in advocacy, there's just no more activated population than the breast cancer world.
Well, one of the things that happened was when the book came out, it was really when the first time in 1990 that there was a book that explained all the things, and breast cancer is getting more complicated. And so I would do a lot of speaking and at one place I said, I don't know what it's going to take for us to get rid of breast cancer. Maybe we should all march topless on the White House. And Bill Clinton was in office, and that image certainly perked everybody up. But that was really the beginning of the breast cancer movement with advocacy. And one of the things we said we needed this money, and we ended up getting it. And Fran Visco, who was also involved at that point, made sure that we kept it in the DoD. Because they had wanted to put it back in the NIH, and then you lose all your control. But in the DoD, we had all the control, and we decided what was going to get funded and what wasn't going to get funded. And to this day, that still funds a lot of the breast cancer research.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So going back to the book, you were reaching out to patients way before it was cool. I think that you might have been if you're a pioneer in anything, this is also one of the critical areas where you were so prescient. But I suspect that because of that, it wasn't all wine and roses, that you really had to fight potentially some resistance. Can you talk about how it was perceived by the medical establishment? Was it something that was really seen as forward-thinking and welcomed, or was there some challenge that this was not what you do as an expert in your field to write for the lay public as opposed to the medical science public?
I mean, more the latter. It really wasn't, explaining things, God forbid, so that people understood them, took away all the mystery and magic. So that wasn't a good thing. But so that wasn't great. I just had found in my practice that I'd been able to figure out how to explain these things in ways that people understood it. And so somebody said, well, you should write a book. The first one took 5 years, I think, the first edition. And I had a writer with me because that was just a regular non-medical writer, because if I couldn't explain it to her, then it wasn't going to work. And so over time, because I was still in practice and I had a kid and all kinds of things going on, it took about 5 years to write the first edition. And then it became more, I think it went into 5 editions before we stopped, and several languages, actually. They're up there in the bookcase there.
But I imagine it must have given you a global audience of people who follow you around like the Beatles came or something.
Well, yeah, to a certain degree, but it definitely is women of a certain age.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you this. I mean, both of you do a lot of, patient education through, online resources, meetings, as well as, through ASCO. do you find that there are advantages of still having a book? Or if you were to do this all over again, let's say if you were writing today, would you just come out with an online version?
I think we're having that debate right now.
I was going to say that.
I mean, I think so. I don't know. I'm a reader. I mean, you're seeing Susan's background there filled with books.
Yeah.
That's, if I were in a different room, my background would look like that. I still think that so many patients come to our office with their printouts and their notebooks and their papers, and there's something good about having something tangible to hold and jot your notes in and dog ear and flip back to. And I think that we all have experienced that as caregivers, that sometimes you just want the copy of your whatever printed out or that written down. And it's why we deliver care plans and survivorship care plans and so much stuff as paper copies to our patients, even in a digital age. So I do still think that there's a lot of value for a book, but I think that communication is changing. And I think, again, we're here recording a podcast. I have met Jack through Twitter. I knew Charu first through Facebook. And so, I mean, I think it's abundantly clear that there are different platforms that patients communicate, that we all communicate through. And those different sound bites of learning, those different experiences are probably the way the current generation of women being diagnosed with breast cancer, of persons being diagnosed with breast cancer, because they're not all women, are going to need to learn and experience the disease. And so trying to figure out techniques to make a book modern, whether that's, QR codes or, embedded within the book.
Are you simultaneously thinking of having something that's more millennial friendly? Because let's face it, all of us are book lovers, but also getting old. Right. So the generation behind us may or may not share the same values. And
the digital format may give you the opportunity to, have video embedded and things like that you can't do otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, as I think I have 3 children in virtual school right now, and I have read clips and highlights from the ASCO Education Scholars material, just in preparing my own lecture content for things like ASCO annual meeting, where they talk about what an average audience can absorb and understand. And, that's to a room full of physicians, which arguably should be a pretty high intelligence, scientific literacy audience, and it's appallingly low, like what we all are able to absorb and comprehend. And so I think that if you add the trauma of a new breast cancer diagnosis, what somebody is going to understand on their first flip through of the Dr. Susan Love breast book versus their 3-year later deep dive, there's going to be different,
all the highlighted areas and
there's going to be different levels of reading. And I think that there's ways to figure this out. I don't know. We should ask you guys, what do you think?
Well, I love books, and I really love the value of having something to actually even handwrite my notes in instead of taking notes on a computer or an iPad. But that's just me.
No, I don't think it has to be an either or anyway. I think you are, we talk about, well, there's maybe a value in putting out content on Twitter and Facebook and maybe even Instagram and TikTok, because you're potentially reaching different audiences. And the same would be for the book versus a digital format. I think it is, as you say, Susan, of a certain age versus the reality is that there are people being diagnosed with breast cancer in their 30s. I know you see this all the time, and you should be using potentially different platforms for those different audiences. They can have the same content, but what draws me particularly about digital is once you've created the content, distributing it is cheap and easy. It's, you can send it anywhere in the world. You can convert it into other things. So that's easy in a way that, you don't have to store or ship it the way
you won't need big bookcases.
Right. Exactly.
In the same vein, I think, especially for breast cancer, data is evolving so quickly and rapidly, and medical treatments are changing every 6 weeks. There's a new antibody drug conjugate, which is better than the previous one. So, Stephanie, I think in your role as the medical advisor to the foundation, how do you envision keeping up with this pace for either digital education or education online or in person?
Yeah, I think that was one of Susan's visions in hiring me, actually. Yeah,
I said I can't keep up with it anymore.
Yeah, you heard her say earlier that when she was first starting out, you just messed with people's ovaries a little bit and you either turned them off or turned them way up and hoped that it changed their hormone levels. But now we've got a new drug every week approved, which is an amazing gift for us as medical oncologists, being able to come up with new strategies to treat this disease, but overwhelming for a breast surgeon, for example, to keep up with. So for me, it's easy because I'm a clinical researcher. I'm at the forefront of helping to develop these drugs through my work with Sarah Cannon, but also as a medical oncologist, I'm using these drugs in practice. So, part of my role with the foundation is going to be to try to both figure out strategies to communicate that back to the lay audience, communicate that back to the patients, to the army of women, but then also help try to figure out new and disruptive angles to find research strategies that could move us beyond drug development. Because we've been doing drug development now for decades and decades and decades, and we're advancing by weeks and months. And maybe it's time to come up with new ideas on how we can change up breast cancer research.
And at the same time, you are coming up with, we are seeing these advances coming out so quickly that it is hard to keep up with. Those of us who are not in the breast cancer field pretty much take a 0 on it. And but you, Stephanie, you also work in the Sarah Cannon network that has community-based oncologists who see 10, 12 different kinds of cancer every day. How are people who see everything able to keep up with this? Because obviously these advances are only valuable to the extent that they're implemented in practice. Are we at a point where we need to have a breast cancer dedicated person managing many or most patients with breast cancer, to the point that even in private practice, you try to have a designated breast cancer specialist within a community-based group?
I think that my answer is a really conflicted answer. My answer is a really conflicted yes and no, right? Okay. Like, I'm a community oncologist who exclusively sees breast, but I am absolutely blown away by my partners that see everything. They are some of the most thoughtful, nuanced, intelligent, well-read, scientifically driven oncologists that I interact with. I mean, it's not that they aren't keeping up with the data. It's that I don't even know. They must download the NCCN guidelines at night when they're sleeping into their souls. I don't understand it.
Haven't found the app
I can't
for
even
that.
pronounce the names of the multiple myeloma drugs anymore. I have no idea what's happening. But at the same time, breast cancer in particular, and I mean, I can say this again to lung cancer researchers, I feel like lung cancer is turning out the same way. You guys have a million different little genomic, if this, then this, if this, then this, and what happens if you have both? I don't know. You flip a coin. You guys know. I don't know. But there is a lot of nuance in breast. And I think one of the really nice things about the broader oncology community is that we all have friends, right? You phone home, you call your training institution, you call people that you did fellowship with that are now subspecialized. You walk down the hall to your partner that is the oncologist and say, hey, what would you do in this particular situation? Patients get second opinions all the time and then choose to stay at their more geographically convenient rural access facility to get the care that the academic specialist may have recommended. And I think that all of those are strategies that we need to implement, especially as we face what's likely going to be an oncology physician shortage in the coming years as our population continues to age and we see more and more cancer.
I want to change gears a little bit.
Oops, please go ahead.
I was going to say, which is why we have to work on prevention too.
Yeah, I was going to change gears a little bit and talk about that. COVID-19 and delays in cancer screening. Talk about preventative medicine. So we all sort of have seen that, a lot of women didn't get mammograms during at least the initial lockdown period, et cetera. What role did the Love Foundation play in, sort of accelerating or promoting this message of awareness to make sure that nobody's delaying their mammograms? And also want to ask you, how far along are we with your self-reading portable ultrasound? And, how do you envision the application to be globally and its impact?
So I'm not a big fan of screening because I think that the way we've set it up, screening is best at finding the good cancers. And it may not actually be that we find the bad cancers early enough to stop them a lot of the time. So I think, it held us for a long time, but I'm not sure that's the best way to go. And one of the things that the self-reading ultrasound that we have an NIH grant for, and are working with GE on, the idea is that most breast cancer in low to middle income countries is premenopausal. And it's going to show up as a lump, both because there isn't screening and because screening's not as accurate in young women. And so, but most lumps in premenopausal women are benign. So you don't have to biopsy and image and do all those things to everybody if you could easily figure out which ones you need to take care of and which ones you don't. So to triage the palpable lumps. So this is a handheld ultrasound made by GE, and we're using artificial intelligence. You hold it over your lump in two directions, and then you would get a red light or a green light. And the idea is the clearly benign cysts and fibroadenomas and that you could leave, and the ones that are suspicious or worrisome, you would go straight ahead. And so they wouldn't have to wait in the queue, everybody waiting to be biopsied. I mean, in Guadalajara, 8-month wait for a diagnostic ultrasound.
Wow.
So if you could, rejigger the queue and get the really suspicious ones in the front, that would help a lot, I think. And so that's what that one is about. The other project we've been working on, I've been wanting to do my whole career, and I finally have a way to do it. Of course, now we have a pandemic, but but that is to map the anatomy of the breast, because believe it or not, nobody ever mapped the anatomy of the human breast ducts. Nobody said how many holes there are in the nipple, where the ducts go, how they're distributed. They're certainly not in quadrants, that's for sure. And we now have a way using, I've tried it in a number of different ways over the years, but now there's a way of speed of sound ultrasound. It's QT ultrasound, it's called. It's available. You lay on your stomach, your breast hangs in water, and the ultrasound waves go across through the water, across your breast and out the other side. And the speed of the sound gets changed with magical mathematics that are above my pay grade into an image. And they can use, it's approved they're doing it for screening right now. And it's good for that. But I challenged them because I wanted to see if we could map the ducts. So I said, well, what if we put a lactating woman in your machine? She'd have milk in the ducts. We'd have that would be contrast. We could see it, and then we'll map it. So they tried it, but the problem I didn't think of is that you lay on your stomach So your breast is hanging down. So all the milk was just a big blob behind the nipple. So that didn't work. So I went back to LA, and they continued it as a challenge. And now they have a way to actually do a 3D. They sent me a 3D printing of breast ducts. And basically, there's 2 or 3 groups in the middle that goes straight up. And then there's some that go around. But they're not in quadrants at all. So the way we do surgery has nothing to do with anatomy. It just sort of is, which is probably why we end up having to do more mastectomies. So I'm all ready to go. We're gonna analyze some of the images they have. As soon as we can start calling in people, we'll start to do this because it's ultrasound, and then we can tell, are we all the same, or are there 3 different patterns, and what about after you breastfeed and then you have involution? Then do the new ducts look the same as the old ducts? Or were there new stem cells that grew back in a whole different direction? I mean, there's a million questions. The breast is it's just amazing what we don't know about the human breast.
Is this the work that you've been working on with the Jet Propulsion Lab? Or
I was working on it with the Jet Propulsion Lab initially.
That's cool.
And that was our first grant. And now we're working with QT Ultrasound. Actually, the Jet Propulsion Lab one is the self-reading one.
Okay.
Yes, and this one we're doing with QT Ultrasound in Northern California. We're trying to get these grants done as we speak.
Very cool.
Could you talk about the power of social media and the interactions that you have on digital platforms? Both Stephanie and Susan, you have a very dedicated following. How has it been to interact with patients on these digital platforms, and how do you keep the messaging on point?
You want to go first?
Stephanie, you go first.
I find communicating with patients on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, to be richly rewarding. I mean, honestly, it's such a different perspective than the interaction that you have with a patient who is your patient in clinic, because you don't have that therapeutic relationship with them. You're learning from them more as colleagues in that physician and patient advocate working side by side perspective. And so you can hear differently about their experience with the disease, the treatment, the side effects, the social stigma, the impact and strain on their relationships, on their financial health, just all of the ways that living with cancer or around cancer affects us. And seeing that and engaging in that is really interesting and powerful. You can also see how richly they're engaging with the medical community and the exact same science and data that we are learning and engaging with, which is so important. I think that most physicians a lot of physicians still feel like their data is this ivory tower that they're standing alone in, not realizing how many patients are able to access it, how readily available it is in the internet era, just at patients' fingertips. And sometimes you can see a patient who you have a very good relationship with struggle with interpretation of data in a way that can help you also distill down where these sticking points are going to be in clinic when you're bringing these facts back to the patients that you're actually caring for. And you can see things that they're struggling with, how they're going to make these decisions for themselves as patient advocates. And that can help you in how you're framing and having these conversations with your patients in a clinical setting. So honestly, very, very richly rewarding. I do sometimes have to kind of take a deep breath and take a step back and say, okay, if I can't click send on this because it's getting a little too close to personal medical advice.
Yeah.
because I do try to stay away from that. I don't want to be in a doctor-patient relationship on Twitter. That's just not what this space is meant for.
Susan?
What do you think, Susan?
Well, I like Twitter. I'm a word person. My wife is a Facebook person. It's just interesting. But so I like Twitter the best, and I like having access to everybody. You have both the patients and the practicing doctors and some of the researchers, and so it really is always educational. One way, in some ways. And I think they serve often as the books did in the past. Instead of having to go out and buy a book, you can go on Twitter and ask somebody, and you can probably find the answer within an hour or two. And so it's interesting how things are changing. And I also think the other thing that gets ignored a lot in cancer, I had leukemia and a bone marrow transplant about 8 years ago. And the biggest thing that I think that gets ignored in my, and I'm doing fine in my care, is the collateral damage from the treatment. I think that now that people are living so much longer, whether it's with breast cancer or leukemia or whatever, we really have to start to look at the long-term consequences of these poisons and drugs we've given them, because a lot of them I still don't have sensation in my feet, for example, 8 years later after the chemotherapy. Not to mention the chemo brain, which is why I was a little bit late for recording. But I think we've got to start paying more attention, since we're more successful at keeping people, curing them or keeping them alive. We've got to pay more attention to the long-term consequences of what we're giving them.
I'd like to ask a little more about your own personal experience with leukemia. I know you were, exceptionally healthy. You were running the day before or the day of, and
yep. I was running marathons in those days. Yeah,
amazing. And you were obviously putting out tons of educational content when it was you. Was your attitude, I have to learn everything there is to know about this, or did you put yourself in the hands of somebody who you trusted to let them drive?
I put my hand, I asked around. I was treated at City of Hope. As you probably know, with Steve Foreman, and I met him, and we trusted, my wife and I, my wife's also a surgeon. We trusted him, and that was it. I'm actually a pretty good patient. I don't second guess. I didn't want to read ahead. I just think
there's different styles, and
just make me better. Yeah,
it's fine. What about in the lung cancer community, Stephanie? You alluded to the kind of splintering of the population into many different driver mutations. A lot of patients have a 1% or a 2% driver mutation. So it just leads to new challenges, because you can't do 1,000 patient randomized trials in 1% populations. But at the same time, we are seeing these patients aggregate online and share information. They often know more than just about any physician on earth, because they're sharing their experiences in a phase 1 trial in a way that even the doctors involved in them are not, maybe. So it's amazing. And I've long felt that it's not a surprise. I mean, you behave as if your life depends on it, and they have the most. They're the most vested in this.
Yeah.
But it's also promoted acceleration of research. I mean, you get these groups online, and they'll go to where a novel trial is and get a few dozen patients on a study that could never have been done before. And I'm wondering, is there such a behavior? What is the impact of the engaged patient population in research in the breast cancer world?
So, I mean, it's exactly the same as the experience that you're describing in lung cancer. I mean, that's the story of,
we were the first breast cancer.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I realize that when you think about breast cancer, I mean, 250,000 women a year are diagnosed with breast cancer. It's a huge number of people, but we have the Male Breast Cancer Coalition, and they have an annual meeting, and they have dozens and dozens and dozens of men that get together for a monthly Zoom meeting, and they just get together and talk about life with male breast cancer. And they have an annual conference, and they all get together, and together they're deriving recruitment and enrollment for trials that include men with breast cancer. And that's the story around reporting density on mammography. One woman found out about how her breast cancer diagnosis was masked by her breast density, and she organized and advocated and found other women with dense breast tissue. And now there's legislation in more states than not about reporting breast density. And the same is, I mean, I can list them for days: inflammatory breast cancer, lobular breast cancer,
triple negative. Yeah, they each have their own group.
BRCA-mediated, PALB2 mutations, breast cancer in ethnic minorities of every possible iteration have subsets that are so powerful and engaged, and it's beautiful. I love that I know where I can point my patients if they're looking for a community.
Well, and also certainly in lung, and it sounds like I believe in breast as well, when you aggregate these really dissimilar populations, you miss a lot. And, because you just obscure the true differences. So being able to delineate, triple negative, the level of granularity now may be more challenging for everyone to keep up with, but that is, I think, a quantum leap rather than just lumping all breast together, so to speak, or lung cancer. It's just not one monolithic population.
I wonder if instead of having, medical professions divided up by surgeons and radiation therapists and oncologists, we'll have it by triple negative and HER2 positive and estrogen positive. I mean, because it makes as much sense as doing it by specialty.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the book and patient education and, online versus book format. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Love Research Army. Can you explain how that started? Because that's not really education focused, but there's really a research initiative behind it.
Yeah. Well, when we first started it, and it's at least 10 years old. It might even be more. I'm terrible at remembering those things. But we started it because I was yelling at researchers to stop using rats and mice so much and use people. And they said, well, we don't know how to find women with breast cancer. And I said, well, I do. And I had the book and I put it out there and we just signed them up. And the great thing about what initially was the Army of Women, and then we started adding the male breast cancer patients. And now it's the Love Research Army. But the idea is you just give us your email. We don't ask for any information. We don't ask for any clinical information, anything. And then researchers come to us with their studies. We vet them. And we have a committee that does it. And then if it passes muster, we e-blast it out to everybody in the Army. And that way, it may not fit you, but your neighbor down the street might be perfect. I mean, the example I was like is we had one study that was looking at Vietnamese women. And I thought, gracious, we probably have one in the whole Army of Women, but we had the right one. She had that study filled in a day. She knew everybody. So it's really by not collecting information and having to keep it up to date and leaving it all in the people, we just use it as a megaphone about people who are doing research. And sometimes the person who lives in Seattle has a cousin in North Carolina who's perfect. You just, if you filter it too much, you don't get it out there. And then that way also people realize what research is going on. And we also have, we have a requirement that the researchers have to report back and do a webinar about the study that they did with our people. So it's just a way to really try to jumpstart the move from mice.
It worked. That's great.
That's an amazing model. I know there are so many organizations that are trying to increase. I mean, this is a critical need, is to increase clinical trial enrollment. And I think you may have just cracked the code in terms of getting the word out. So that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, the key thing is not to collect too much information, because that changes and then doesn't stay accurate.
Yeah.
Because we've all heard as investigators how often companies or cooperative groups tell us that we can't advertise the trial because then it's, I don't know, it's frowned upon. And I'm like, wait, we're not allowed to tell people we're doing research? What?
Yeah. They want you to do research. The patients want you to do research.
Absolutely.
They want to join these trials.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, plus I think you also give the idea, Susan, of listening to what the patients are concerned about, like survivorship issues, could really change the direction of how we do things, that it isn't all what we surmise people care about or what is pharma driven as much as what truly matters to patients. It's great.
Right. And some of it may be different person to person, but I still don't have any taste. They always do the COVID taste or smell. I lost that with chemo. I've never gotten it back. So I became a vegetarian because meat is really boring if you can't smell or taste. But there's all kinds of things like that when you're the physician or the provider, you say, oh, well, but it's just taste and smell. But that's a lot to lose. I miss it.
Well, it was really, really terrific to speak with both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Beyond the Journal is a production of Beacon Medical Interchange with support and distribution from Mark Lindsay of Talk and Speaker. We hope that you will subscribe, share comments, feedback, and find us on iTunes or wherever you find content. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Susan, for joining us today.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.